Hey, okay. So welcome along to what I believe is the sixth session of Biodynamics 101. Um, so as you presumably know by now, my name's Rowan and I'm the one hosting this evening. For anybody that's joining us live, there should be some links pasted into the chat. I shall just do that now. Oh, if you scroll up, you can find them, but dear, I appear to not be able to do that. Oh well, if you scroll up in the chat, you'll be able to find them. And for anybody listening back on YouTube, those links should be in the description for you. If you are listening on YouTube and you'd like to tune in live next time to this or one of the many other things that happen over on the Discord server, then you can go over to rosefolk.xyz to learn more. So this week we're looking at compost heaps, tree paste, and cow pat pits. But first, as always, I'll read us in with a prayer by Adam Bittleston. Measureless the starry heights, and measureless the depths of earth, and about us, everywhere, light receiving, warmed by wonder, spirits weave man's destiny. May the shelter of this house be a place of wakening. Peace within us, peace among us. Amen. So in the last two sessions, we've looked at making the 9 biodynamic preparations. And this week we're going to be learning about how we use those preparations in our garden, in particular in our compost pit, in our compost heaps, and in things called cow pat pits, which are pretty much exactly what the name suggests, and using those preparations on trees in the form of a tree paste. So first up, we have biodynamic compost heaps. This is where you'll be using preps 502 to 507, as discussed in the last two episodes. Compost heaps are the life of a thriving garden, even one that isn't gardened biodynamically. So getting your compost heap right is always incredibly important. So to start with a biodynamic compost heap, you're first going to need your compost bin. And I don't mean one of those plastic ones that you can buy in most gardening and DIY stores, but one that's made out of preferably untreated wood, or if that's not available, 4 wooden posts and some chicken wire wrapped around. Although with the chicken wire ones, they are much harder to turn, which you do every 6 months or so. So I would recommend using wood if that's something that's available to you. Just 4 sides, not a bottom, made out of planks screwed together will do. Making them whatever size that you need, but I generally recommend about 4 foot back and 5 foot wide, but anything to fit your space. And there are lots of tutorials available on YouTube teaching you how to do this, so I won't go into details on that here. Your compost heap does need direct contact with the soil below so that worms can come up if it decays. That's really important because without worms eating the compost, you're going to find it goes really slimy and mouldy, which you really don't want. It's not going to be very good for your plants, and it's also not going to smell very nice. So once you've got your frame for your compost heap, at the very, very bottom on the exposed soil, you want to put a thin layer of dried twigs. This is generally prunings off of thin stalked plants that have been left to dry, but anything similar will work. Sometimes something quite common if you've trimmed recently is to use the straw essentially that has been produced by that. What this does is this encourages the airflow where the compost heap meets the soil. So this is going to decay slightly slower than the rest of the heap, which means that at the bottom you've got just a bit of space for the heap to breathe. On top of those twigs, you're going to be adding alternating layers of green waste and woody waste. So with the wood, it really helps to shred it if possible. You can even just buy wood chip. At my allotment site, we have a bay where we get wood chip dumped by a local university. And that's just free to anybody to borrow away and use. So that's something that I use quite often. But just as small pieces of wood as possible. You can even saw them up, or if it's smaller, woodier plants and stems, you can cut those up with some secateurs or something. That just means that it'll break down a bit better. If you can't cut it up, then it's perfectly fine to put larger pieces in, but do be aware that they're not going to rot down anywhere near as quickly, so it will take much longer for your compost to be used. Crushed up eggshells. It's advisable to let these dry before you use them. So I've got a jar in my kitchen where I put my crushed eggshells, and they sit there until they're ready to go into the compost heap. And I've certainly noticed it on plots at my allotment site, that people will just put whole, mostly non-crushed eggshells in, and they go mouldy so quickly, and they don't smell very pleasant, and they attract pests. If you can't wait for them to dry naturally, you can put them in the oven. And the other, although slightly more time-consuming option, is to sit and individually peel the membrane on the inside of the eggshell off of each piece of eggshell, but that does take a really long time. So just stick them in the oven for a little while if you don't have the time to wait for them to dry out naturally. Adding these eggshells boosts the calcium content in our compost heap, so they're really quite important. As we discussed, I believe it was last week, with preparation 505, which is oak compost. With the oak bark, we put this inside of a cow skull, not a cow skull, a sheep skull, or a pig skull, but I personally use sheep. And what that does is that adds more calcium into our compost heap. So again, the eggshells are just another way of doing that. And you want to continue to add these alternating layers until your compost heap is almost full, or you're almost out of waste to add. So a good garden generally benefits from having at least 2 heaps of compost, because 1 year's worth of green and woody waste is often more than enough to fill one heap, especially if you're gardening a lot and you've got a lot of waste. So you know your own garden, you know how much green and woody waste you're producing, so you can play it by ear on that one, but it's generally a good idea to have 2 heaps. Now that you've got your heap almost filled to the top, it's time to add our preparations. So to do this, the first step is to make prep balls. So you've got your jars full of the pre-made preparations that we've been discussing previously, and making the balls basically just means that they're not going to blow away if a gust of wind happens to hit your garden whilst this is rotting down. So instead of sprinkling them directly on top, what we do is take a handful of slightly damp fresh earth or old fully rotted compost, maybe out of last year's bin. This is another good argument for having 2 compost bins, because you can have a bin full of already rotted down old compost that you're using and a bin of new stuff that you're allowing to rot down now. And you want to take this earth, again slightly damp so that it'll compact quite nicely, and you want to, in the palm of your hands, roll it into a nice tight ball, and then you want to press a well into the centre of that ball with your thumb, and then take a pinch of your preparation, and we're doing these individually, so for each of your compost preparations you will need a separate ball of earth, and you want a pinch, about a teaspoon of your prep, put it into the well that you've just created, and squeeze the ball closed around it. And these balls then go into our heap. So if you're stood facing your heap at the point at which you're filling, you want to place your Yarrow 502 in the far left corner, the left corner furthest away from you, Oak 505 in the far right, Nettle 504 in the very centre, Chamomile 503 in the near left, and Dandelion 506 in the near right. We separate these as they work better individually. So they all do separate bits for the compost, as we've discussed previously, and we want to allow them to do their own thing individually, because that helps harmonise our compost more effectively and introduce the necessary chemical and spiritual properties into our heap. These do eventually get mixed, so about 6 months after you've made your heap, you do turn it, which is exactly what it sounds like, and you add more preps at that stage. But allowing them to begin to rot down separately is important to let them do their jobs. Once you've got all of your preps in place, you now add 1 or 2 very last layers of your green and woody waste before you start preparing your Valerian 507. This is done by diluting 1 part of valerian in 19 parts of clean rainwater. And dynamising for 20 minutes by stirring with your bare hand as opposed to a stick or a piece of wood or something, going clockwise and then anti-clockwise, breaking the vortex, much as we've discussed previously. After 20 minutes, our valerian prep is ready to be splashed over top of the heap. Again, just using your hands and flicking large droplets onto the top of the compost heap. What this does is it helps seal in our other preparations and add warmth to our heap via the valerian. If you're anticipating rain, you can cover your heap with some cardboard, or some people use a piece of carpet, although I personally prefer mine just to be allowed to face the elements. I find that this encourages just a bit of of my genius loci back into the compost, and also cardboard and carpet go mouldy, and in some places this just isn't allowed on your site. So I would get into a lot of trouble if I took pieces of carpet down to my allotment. I could use cardboard, but it just goes mouldy and soggy quite quickly and doesn't seem like a great idea. So another method of creating compost in your garden, which is particularly aimed at people that don't have the space or the waste for a full compost heap, is what's known as a cowpat pit, or CPP, or otherwise known as barrel compost. So barrel compost was invented by Maria Thun, who also invented the biodynamic planting calendar in the early 70s. And she'd drawn inspiration from birch pit preparations created by German farmers who'd attended Steiner's original agriculture course in 1924. And what they used to do was, in the winter months when they had their cows in sheds, is they'd pile all of their manure out of those sheds and into a birch pit. So this is just a smaller scale version of that. And these pits are great for creating compost in small quantities quite quickly. Regular compost heaps can take a year or more to be ready to use on your land, but barrel compost should be ready in about 6 months, which makes it ideal for the smaller scale garden, or for those of us who just weren't on it enough last year to finalise our compost heap. And I am almost definitely talking about myself when I say that. So for this method, you're going to need a half barrel, or if a half barrel's not accessible to you, because they can be quite expensive, a self-created wooden frame of similar dimensions, or just to suit the space that you've got. Fresh local cow manure, basalt dust, crushed eggshells, and all of your standard compost preps. To create a cowpat pit, we're going to take a half barrel and remove its base, or, as mentioned, a 4-sided wooden frame, again without a bottom. You then sink your barrel or frame into the ground so it's covered to the brim on all sides externally by soil, and the bottom is in direct contact with your soil. Also for this, you're going to need some sort of mixing board, or just a piece of tarpaulin will do if that's not possible. Just something that you can move, that you can put your manure on to begin with. So you now want to tip your manure onto a mixing board, and then into that manure we're going to add crushed eggshells, crushing them fairly fine. If you've pre-prepared them at home, quite often what I do is just crush them in a mortar and pestle. It's quite a good way of getting that done without having to stand there and crush them up with your hands afterwards. Again, this raises calcium levels and also adds a dry ingredient to our wet to stop it becoming quite so waterlogged. Now you want to mix in a handful or so of basalt dust, and we're going to stir our mixture for 1 hour to aerate and combine the ingredients. So this is done by taking a spade and standing outside where you've poured your manure, and turning your mixture in a spiral motion outside in, so scooping up the outside bit and putting it into the middle, and continuing to do that for about an hour. This can be made easier and a bit more fun, a bit more of a laugh if you've got a friend or two to help you. So if that's the case, you want to stand opposite or in a triangle with those people and just work in a circle around, doing exactly as just mentioned. Take the outside and putting it in the middle for a full hour. After your hour's over, your manure should be the consistency of a thick mousse, and it's now ready to be added into your barrel. So you just want to spade that in and make sure it's fairly level and well packed down. Once you've got it in and levelled, you want to take a stick and make 6 holes in the same formation as mentioned above. So all 4 corners and the centre. And I possibly believe that there ought to be 2 central holes a few inches apart from each other, depending on the dimensions of your pit. And the extra 6 hole is for your valerian. So we're going to make our prep balls in the same configuration as before, but this time instead of using soil or compost, you're going to be using manure out of your pit. So just keeping a little bit aside. Placing them again in the same formation as before, and closing the holes immediately once you've placed them. So making one, putting it in, covering it over, and then making the next, putting it in and covering it over. Once they're in place and closed, you're now going to dynamise your Valerian 507, exactly as we've mentioned before. We pour half of our mixture into the final hole, and then we splash the remaining in order to just lightly saturate a Hessian sack with. Once you've got your 507 over your heap and you've got your Hessian sack soaked, you want to just put your dampened Hessian sack over the top. This is going to provide some insulation whilst also being breathable and allowing air to come in and out. At this point, we then cover our pit with a large board of preferably wood, although I've seen people use slate, setting it at an angle with some sticks so that it's not covering the top of the pit. You've just got it propped up on the front side to allow rainwater to run off of it. 8 weeks from you doing this, you're going to scoop your manure back out and onto your mixing board or tarp and repeat this process again, adding the same amount of preparations, just a teaspoon in a ball of manure once you've done mixing for an hour. And from there, you wait about 5 months and your manure should be ready to use. So we don't use this like standard manure. If you're used to just normal gardening, you'll be used to just digging manure into the soil or allowing it to rot down on a compost heap. Instead, with CPP, what we do is we take with 20 parts water, dynamising it for 20 minutes, and then applying it as a spray onto our soil or seed trays, preferably on an afternoon where the moon is descending and the soil is therefore breathing in. Root days are the absolute ideal time for this. At this point, it's worth mentioning that you can also buy, I think it's called Mussadorf, although I will check that and post in the Biodynamics chat later, which is essentially just a hyper-concentrated for a compost heap or for a barrel pit. It's sort of an easy way to do this, somewhere like on a balcony. The very last thing that we're discussing today is tree paste. So in biodynamics, trees aren't viewed as separate to the rest of our land. Instead, when we look at a tree, we don't see it as necessarily part of the plant. It's just the soil that supports the leafy greens, the leaves, and the leaves are seen a lot like lettuce. But obviously, we can't pack compost around tree leaves. So instead, we apply tree paste to the bark of the trunk of the tree. So in order to make tree paste, you're going to need some fine sand, builder's sand's ideal, or silica powder, although that is more expensive, some cow manure, some potter's clay or bentonite, or if your garden soil is clay-based, like the soil at my allotment is, you can use that instead. You also need mare's tail tea, 508 preparation, and horn manure. And you can use CPP here, although that is optional. It's just a good way of adding all of the other preps as well as the horn manure and mare's tail into your tree paste for a bit of an extra boost. So in your bucket, you take your clay and some rainwater, chopping with a spade and mixing until it's smooth with no lumps, making sure you've removed all of the stones. Now, in a separate container, just a little plastic jug will do fine for this. You dissolve your horn manure in your 508 tea, which we discussed making last time, and you dynamize this for 1 hour, again stirring clockwise and then anti-clockwise, breaking the vortex. If you're using CPP, you add this 40 minutes into the dynamizing process and dynamize for another 20 minutes. Then you add this mixture into your bucket with your clay and then stir in your fresh cow manure until it's fully combined. And finally, we stir in our sand or silica powder until the mixture resembles a gritty, almost pancake batter-like consistency. You then paste this onto the trunk and lower areas of wood, making sure you're getting into all of the crevices of the bark. Doing this in late autumn or early spring, after you've pruned, but before the new spring buds start to appear, so timing this is quite important. You want to do this on a sunny but not too hot day, and especially not on a day where the rain's forecast, otherwise your paste's just going to wash straight off. In doing this, we've added all of our nutrients that we expect from things like CPP and our horn manure into the tree in a way that it's going to absorb in and benefit the fruit that we'll be collecting from this later. So this is great for apple trees or even grapevines. I've heard people using this on. So it's a pretty get compost. Of course, you can compost around the base of a tree, but this tree paste is a perfect way to make sure it's getting directly into your tree. So that brings us to the end of this week's session. It's a little bit shorter than last week's, that's for sure. Do we have any questions before we finish? Shall take a sip of my water while you're typing. Yes, ants do have a tendency to do that. Maybe they're making their own ant version of tree paste. I'm not 100% sure why they do that. Maybe want to look up because I've got absolutely no idea, but I've also noticed this happening. And little balls of soil as well. I'm not sure if it's just their method of waste disposal, maybe. I've got no idea. But yeah, no, that is something ants do. Perhaps you can use that in your tree paste. So, to answer your question, Richard, I personally use the Maria Thumb one. There is a free online version, but I don't know how much the calendar differs place to place. I'm assuming it does because of planetary placement as the Earth rotates, but I will link the free version in the biodynamic chat after we're done that I'm using. You should be able to buy the book online, but I do think there must be free versions for different countries. I just can't find any when I'm Googling, but it's the Maria Thun Biodynamic Calendar. And again, I'll link the free version that I've been using in chat once we're finished here. And yes, to answer your question, Cybernaut, it does create its own warmth. So we find as things rot, they heat up anyway. It being set into the soil's also pretty good for warmth. And the sack over the top just provides a little bit of insulation. So it is sort of self-warming. So inside, are we talking about compost bins or the buried pits with manure? I'm assuming you mean compost bins. Generally, so nothing cooked can go into compost bins. If you're looking at disposing of cooked food waste, then you want a wormery. Any kitchen waste that's raw, so any vegetables and eggshells are fine. You don't want to be putting meat in there. And I personally would try and avoid seeds where possible, although quite often it isn't possible. In general, compost bins are pretty free for all as long as it is just plant matter going in. Another popular thing to add is coffee grounds and stuff. So yeah, any raw kitchen waste is fine, but nothing cooked and no meat or fish or anything like that. Right, if that's all our questions, I will finish up. So next week, we're going to be looking at practical applications for biodynamics on a much smaller scale than we've previously discussed. Up until now, our discussions have focused on gardens and allotments, and they can be applied wider onto things like farms. But next week, we're going to be talking about biodynamic gardening in windowsill pots or on balconies. So do be sure to tune in for that. And I would just like to add here that I'm slowly working on some small video tutorials of the preparations and other things we've discussed here on Biodynamics 101, as well as some more general biodynamic gardening content. So make sure you keep an eye out for those. The first one should be available shortly after the autumn equinox, but I will keep you posted in chat for all of that. And those will be available directly on the Rosefolk YouTube channel. So that's it for this week, and I'll read us out with another delightful prayer by Adam Bittleston. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Upon the sustaining earth may we be upright. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Flowers and trees around us, upon the living earth may our hearts waken. Spirits of the heights have sent their messengers. Birds and beasts about us, of all earth's offspring may we be guardians. Earth's changes, Christ may we find. Amen. And as always, I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening and go out and start composting.